is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Ingenious You community.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I would like to start out by asking you to reflect back across your career from Berkeley to Smith College and before that, and ask you to talk about the most defining moments, whether they were breakthroughs or challenges that shaped your approach to leadership. And if there were any experiences in particular that fundamentally changed how you lead or revealed insights that you wouldn't have anticipated.
Let me start with one incident. It was a long time ago when I was chair of the English department, and I was meeting with a very angry student who was really disappointed and angry that there were not enough places in the honors seminar, in the senior honors seminar in English, that he really wanted to take. And and he expressed his anger, and I said to him, I'm really sorry. If I were in your position, I would feel exactly the same way. And suddenly he just deflated. And he said, that's all I wanted. I wanted someone to understand how I feel. And that was so revealing to me. And it made me realize, I mean, think as not just as a leader, as a person, when somebody speaks to you with a sense of discontent or anger or complaint, you want to fix it. And I realized I couldn't fix this. I couldn't create another section for him. But I learned from that really listening to what someone is saying and to say something that communicates that you heard them was absolutely essential to leadership. So that was one really defining moment in my career as a leader. I would say another came, this is much, much more recent, during the pandemic, in which we had to figure out how to coordinate at Berkeley, a huge university, essentially in absentia, without people being in the same room. And I realized I had to create a series, a whole set of interlocking work groups in which the leaders of those groups met by Zoom, the same way that we're on Zoom all the time. So again, it was a lesson about communication and what you have to do to assure communication in particularly challenging circumstances.
Was there one thing that stands out that you took away from that? We all have our pandemic stories, but I'm wondering if there's one thing that has really stuck with you that you can look back on and say, yeah, that was so important that we did that particular thing.
I think that I mean, this is more abstract perhaps
Sure.
as an answer you're looking for, but I learned from the pandemic how you had to make decisions with imperfect information, that it was really important to make decisions rather than wait for all the information that you might want to have make a better decision.
Sure, those are such valuable leadership lessons for everybody. We've all had angry students or angry faculty members in our
Yeah.
offices, and that the lesson to stop and listen and validate the person in front of us is so critically important. So I'm really glad that you led with that as a
Thank
learning.
you.
Yeah. So let me ask you about women's colleges and your experience working within women's colleges. Now, you are the first woman, you were the first woman chancellor in Berkeley's history. And having both studied and led women's colleges, I'm wondering how these experiences shaped your development as a leader.
And that's such an interesting question. I've thought about it a lot myself. And I, my first job out of graduate school was at Berkeley. I was at Berkeley for
Mhm.
my entire career before I went to Smith. And fairly early in my career, started doing administrative jobs. And I was lots of times the only woman in the room. And I remember the chancellor's conference room at the point that I was there had on one wall of it, it was a long conference room, on one wall had pictures, photographs of all of the chancellors of Berkeley, all male. On the other wall, opposite them, there were a set of drawings of Picasso-like dancing nudes. And I used to go into that room being one of, one or two women in the room, around a table that sat like 30 people and think, my goodness, this visual display says it all. My experience at Smith was tremendously important to me in my evolution as a leader because I found it so liberating
Mm.
to be at a women's college where most of the leadership positions were held by women. I found it very freeing. And when I went back to Berkeley, I think my sense of my own abilities as a leader and my own style as a leader had really changed because of my experience at Smith. So I give it enormous credit, the experience of being in this female world, which was all about women's realization of their potential.
Sure. How did your leadership change? Uh,
I
while you,
became freer. I became freer, more confident
uh-huh.
of of who I was. There was less of a distance between my sense of my authentic self and my leadership, whereas I had been in my Berkeley career previous to that more guarded.
Mm.
So it was a very liberating, freeing experience for me.
Yeah, what wonderful affirmation for the value of women's colleges, which, as you know, are disappearing from the landscape of higher education. Do you have an opinion about the role that women's colleges play or should continue to play in today's environment?
I still think it's a really, really a valuable choice in higher education for lots of women. It's funny at Smith that students sometimes came to Smith despite the fact, not because of the fact it was a women's college, but then within a semester, they often would come to the conclusion that it was the best thing about it,
Mm.
that they really, really um, uh, learned and developed because of its being a largely female environment. It wasn't entirely female, but largely female environment. And I think that's still important. The applications to women's colleges, the remaining ones, have really been up.
Mm.
And I think that suggests that there's a real desire for women's colleges still in some populations.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. So now your leadership journey has included a number of things ranging from personal loss to demanding responsibilities and hard decision making. How did you cultivate resilience through these challenges? And do you have any advice, particularly for women leaders, on maintaining balance?
Well, I think that it's really important to all of these jobs could take more than 24 hours a day if you let them. And to me, it's been important to set priorities, to realize what is essential and what can be delegated, and to maintain the things that you do that are absolutely essential to what makes you the person you are. So I never stopped reading books in all of my various positions. I never stopped doing music. Music is very important to me. And I always tried to make time for friends, for family, and to set boundaries. I think you're better at these kinds of very big jobs if you maintain both the things that are essential in making you you,
Mm.
and also maintaining the space and time in your life for things you really enjoy. And of course, you should sleep, you should eat well. I mean, the things that I'm always telling students they should do.
Yeah, boy, that's such wise advice. Music, are you a music an instrumentalist or a singer or what's
I play both the piano and the viola, and
okay.
I never stopped playing the viola in all my years of leadership, and I play the piano a lot of it, not all the time, but so it's very important to me.
You know, it's
It really
interesting.
it's almost like a kind of meditation for me.
Yeah.
When you play music, you can't be thinking about something else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm a classically trained pianist, and
Oh, really?
I've run into a number of in the interviews I've done, a number of presidents who have a background in music, and they say something very similar to you. Um, so
Yeah, it also what I love the most is playing chamber music. And when you play chamber music, you can't just say it's all about me.
right.
You have to listen to the other players. You have to really be part of an ensemble. And that to me is very much what leadership is about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So now you've led through some obviously turbulent times, financial crises, political unrest, the pandemic, which you have already discussed. How do you think, or how have you seen the demands of leadership change over, let's say, the decades? And what qualities, what leadership qualities have been most essential to navigating these shifts, whether on your part or in what you've seen in other leaders?
First of all, when I first started uh, taking leadership positions, you would get a folder of mail in the morning. It had already been read by someone in your staff, often with some very helpful notes on it about how to respond. You would read it. You would then talk to the staff member who was responsible for sending an answer. And then that person would draft an answer and you would look at it. And then it would be prepared and you would sign it. I mean, the whole cycle of communication was much, much slower. That even if you were really fast about it, maybe it would take a week between the time that you received the letter and the time you sent an answer. Now, people send emails and expect you to respond in the hour. So that the tempo of communication has become much, much faster. And the price for miscommunication has become much, much higher.
Mm.
It's so public, everything that you write in an email. And so it can lead to a tremendous vulnerability and and often as a consequence, a kind of lack of spontaneity. You get so, frightened of saying something that's going to create problems that you don't say anything. You write things that are pablum or just really don't say anything. And so I think the biggest change in the circumstances of leadership has to do with the pace and the medium of communication, that you're always on not just one stage, multiple stages in which people can take whatever you've said and often make a kind of issue of it on social media
Mm.
with no actual contact with you, just taking your words. So that to me is the biggest change. And I it, it even more, I mean, communication is always important for leadership, but even more, communication is so important. How to figure out, maintaining authenticity, being a good storyteller. Those are so important, and I think increasingly so as the modality of communication has changed.
Mm. Now, in other interviews, you have highlighted the importance of empathy, which I think is related to what you just said in part. Both as a literary scholar and as a leader, you've talked about the importance of empathy. So can you say a little bit more about how empathy has changed or shaped your leadership, particularly during those moments of tension or conflict?
I would like to think that my empathy has grown and developed. I mean, certainly for all of us, the world, when I think about the world of Berkeley at the beginning of my career, almost entirely a white institution,
Mm,
very little consciousness. I mean, there was certainly, it was right when I started my position at Berkeley, it was right after the civil rights movement in the 60s. So there was certainly a consciousness of the kinds of challenges faced by Black people in the United States. But there was very little sense of other identity groups and not very much presence of any of them.
mm,
So that there's been, I hope, a broadening of all of our um, senses, social consciousness of the different identities and experiences that people bring to the communities they inhabit. Uh, so that's been really important to me. There's also, it seems to me, particularly in this world, the post-pandemic world, there's still so much social isolation. It's in part, I still think we're living in a kind of pandemic hangover in
mm,
which we haven't gotten back to the kinds of in-person relationships that are so much the texture of life. The combination of that and social media um, creates often a kind of othering of
mm,
others, if you know what I mean, and
mhm.
an isolation. And that makes empathy all the more important. I always think to understand any problem, you have to figure out where the other person is coming from. And that in order to do that, you need empathy. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with them. It doesn't mean you're going to do what they want you to do, but you have to understand how they got there, what they're thinking about.
Mm. Well, and that goes back to what you said at the very beginning about some of your key leadership learnings and the importance of listening deeply to people. Yeah. So, um, you have also mentioned the importance of decisiveness, even when facing opposition. So, can you share an example of a particularly difficult decision that you've had to make and how you stayed the course despite the challenges and how you knew maybe that you had to stay the course?
Yeah, I think the most difficult decision that I've made was to build on People's Park. People's Park is just a storied, 4 acres of land in Berkeley that was taken over in a protest in the 60s. It was the site of intervention by the National Guard, and the students and community at that point took it over, created what was then imagined as quite idyllic park and community. Over the decades, it's certainly deteriorated. It had become a homeless encampment, a lot of drug trafficking. violence, and Berkeley had an acute need for more student housing, has an acute need for more student housing. And this is the largest piece of land that was close to campus. And so I determined that we needed to build on People's Park. Everyone told me, you can't do this. There's going to be violence. You will not succeed. I had a mayor of Berkeley tell me, I'm going to fight you tooth and nail if you try to build on People's Park. But I knew it was the right thing to do. I also knew, because being Chancellor of Berkeley, I knew it was my last job, that I had the kind of, I wasn't looking for another job. And so I could make a hard decision, and I stayed the course. And we are now building on People's Park. But it was very hard, and it had political costs to it. My house was vandalized. It was a difficult decision, but we stayed the course, and I'm very glad we did.
Interesting observation about being able to make the hard decision because you were at the end of your career, which I've had other presidents tell me who have been close to retiring, that they probably couldn't have made some of those decisions earlier in their career when they were more concerned about the implications, which is somewhat telling about the challenges and the context for leadership, I think.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And I also think in relationship to decisiveness, that it's often better to make a decision than to make no decision at all, even if it's not the perfect decision. That I really believe in making the best decision you can with the information that's available. I think decisiveness is a very important element of leadership.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, have you always been decisive, or is that something that you had to cultivate the capacity for as you have led?
It was something that I certainly have cultivated the capacity for. It wasn't that I was indecisive and became decisive,
Yeah.
but I became increasingly aware of how important it was to make decisions. I mean, what my philosophy was of decision making is to communicate a great deal about how the decision was going to be made, who was going to be consulted, what my reasoning, sort of prior to it. It matters that people understand what the process is and who has a voice in the process. And then once you've made a decision, to explain why you've reached that conclusion and then stick to it. It's a very poor leadership, in my view, to make a decision and then when you get the inevitable pushback, to change the decision. I mean, people want clear leadership, and that means if you've reached a decision that you feel is the right decision, you really need to stick to it rather than retreat from it the minute someone says that they don't agree with you.
Yeah, for sure. Now, as you know, fundraising and entrepreneurship are increasingly central to university leadership. How did you adapt to those aspects of the role? Do you have any advice for future leaders on how to develop themselves as fundraisers, or as it relates to innovating or entrepreneurship, how you balance the tradition of the college campus with the necessary innovation?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I really learned most of what I know about fundraising from my experience at Smith. I'll tell you a story about a Berkeley story before I went to Smith about fundraising. It's the first time I had ever been on a fundraising call. I was having lunch with a donor to ask him for a gift. I think it was like $30,000. It wasn't a very big gift by today's standards for fellowships in art history. And we were having a lovely lunch. I was there with, development officer was with me, and the donor. And we were, just having a wonderful lunch, lots of conversation. We with dessert and coffee. And all of a sudden, I realized someone was kicking me under the table, and it was a development officer. And and so I was so nervous about this, and I screwed my courage to the sticking point and asked this donor whether he would give this gift. And he broke into this hearty laughter, and he said, "I was wondering when you were going to get to that." And I realized from that, I mean, one of the things that's really important in fundraising is to realize what motivates donors.
Mm.
People don't agree to meet with you um, unless they intend to give a gift. They're not going to be in a situation in which they understand that's probably what the purpose of the meeting is. And one of the things that so moved me in my career is understanding how philanthropists are motivated by wanting to make an impact
Mm.
on an institution they love through their philanthropy. And so the actually wonderful thing about it is trying to figure out what both fulfills the needs of the institution and also is very fulfilling to the donor. So many people say to me, "Oh, I bet you hate fundraising. It must be the worst part of your job." And they have, I don't know, they think it's like selling Girl Scout cookies or something. And it's really not at all. It's really reaching a kind of agreement with someone
Mm.
who wants to do something that's beneficial with their wealth. And so I find it one of the most deeply rewarding parts of leadership. I really, really enjoyed fundraising, but you need to understand it is not, I'm asking for something that's really embarrassing to me, but rather it has to do with the donor's
Mm.
desire to have an impact with the wealth that they're gifted to possess.
Mm.
Um, Entrepreneurship is a little bit different. It is absolutely essential for anyone in an institution, whether public or private, to be thinking about multiplying and diversifying income streams, and entrepreneurship is a big one. And there, I always, it's not so much your entrepreneurship, it's really understanding, it's usually faculty, sometimes staff, who have the best ideas, enable them to put those ideas into action, and to but always to have a sense of what institutional values are and not violate those values. I always think that institutions, especially colleges and universities, are innately conservative.
Mm.
Uh, but you have to always work to make sure everyone understands that we're always changing,
Mm.
that circumstances change, institutions change, and entrepreneurship has become an important part of leadership in just about every institution. You have to be awake to that, alive to that. But it's rather different from fundraising, at least in my view of it. It's more, oh, I'm using the same word to describe it. It's more entrepreneurial.
Mm.
And sometimes they overlap in interesting ways. A number of our donors are very interested in ways in which they can, but through their philanthropy, advance entrepreneurship in the university.
Yeah, for sure. I really like the way you framed both of those things. When it comes to fundraising and philanthropy, you're talking about being focused on the donor as opposed to yourself as the asker. And
Mm,
that is such
right.
a freeing and refreshing way to think about the work of fundraising. So thank you for that. Now, I want to switch gears, talk a little bit about crisis management. During your time leading Berkeley, you have faced wildfires, protests, and the pandemic, among other things. Are there some leadership principles or strategies that you found to be most effective for you and your team in how to manage the crises that came up?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's really important to realize when a crisis comes up, it's not you sitting alone in your room. It's really important to identify the team that's going to be responsible for dealing with the crisis and to make sure that they meet frequently. So we had a kind of philosophy of crisis management at Berkeley. We didn't have any shortage of situations in which we had to use it, in which we would identify the team that was appropriate to that crisis. We had the equivalent of a situation room, and which that team met, and it met frequently, often every morning, sometimes every morning and every evening. And it's really important that people know who the team is and that you have the right people in the room for every aspect of the crisis. So I think the most important thing about crisis management is understanding who has to be in the room, make that group of people explicitly a team, and have a very frequent rhythm of meeting.
Very, very helpful. So let me ask you about the next generation of leaders and your work with students. I understand that working with students and interacting with students has been something that you've really enjoyed over the course of your tenure as a leader. So what advice do you have to offer to young leaders today who are passionate about making a difference? They may be looking around and questioning the world and the order of things. And what advice, from your perspective, would you offer to them?
I first of all, take opportunities for leadership, and and then when you've taken an opportunity for leadership, try to figure out what are the things that you can achieve in that particular position, in that particular organization, and then set about figuring out what an implementation plan might be. There's a book on leadership that I really like that talks about the greatest challenge of leadership not being good ideas, but rather good implementation. It's
Mm.
something that I have felt is a real truth throughout my career. It's also, I mean, with students, often I mean, there's this phrase, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. They often feel like they can change the world immediately. And if that's not always the case, you have to choose a more local way to start developing your skills, your effectiveness. I remember a conversation I once had with a fairly young Smith alum, and she had a job, and she saw some things in her workplace that she thought could be better. So she goes right to the head of the company and tells him, and she finds out that that wasn't so well regarded by her immediate boss, and 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 so she said, I learned so much from that because I was so used to it, Smith. I could go right to
Mhm.
you, tell you what I thought, but I realized companies don't work like that. And it's, so that was kind of interesting. But I love working with young people because they're so full of ideals, a sense of what their impact is. They want to be on the world, and so I mean, the advice I have is to choose an organization or a task that matters to you, and then hone your leadership skills and also your execution skills in that particular that particular position.
Mm. Now, let me ask you about free speech. I know that that's been a defining issue as well throughout your tenure. How have your views on balancing free expression with community values evolved over the years?
Oh, they've evolved quite a bit. I began and ended my chancellorship at Berkeley with a free speech crisis. The
Mm.
first free speech crisis was really about the capacity of the campus to have very conservative speakers um, speak uninterrupted. And I felt there was shortly before I became chancellor, a provocateur named Malo Yiannopoulos had come to campus to speak. There was a riot. He didn't get to speak because of that. The police got him out of there, got the audience out of there because it was a very dangerous situation. And when I became chancellor, I realized that this was a huge reputational danger to Berkeley, that we couldn't have speakers speak uninterrupted with views that were very different from many people on the campus. And so I used the police presence that I needed to protect those speakers and their ability to speak. And I successfully did that. Then the free speech crisis with which my chancellorship ended was one that many colleges and universities were facing, which was the conflict around Israel and Gaza.
Mm.
And there it was a very, very different crisis because it was, student against student, faculty member against faculty member, staff member against staff member. And I came to the realization through thinking deeply about this that free speech is particularly at a public institution, it's an absolute. You are legally obliged to protect people's First Amendment rights. But I realize that's not the only value that's important in the community. It's also important to uh, to, um, uh, think about the impact of your speech on the community. So I often used to say, just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean that it's right to say.
Mm.
And we had, after the first free speech crisis that was spurred by the riot in relationship to Malo Yiannopoulos, and then I used the police presence to assure conservative speakers could speak. There were many members of the community that were very troubled by this. And so what we did was it had a free speech commission that had hearings, issued a report, and they had a lot of wisdom. And one of the things that's interesting about being in a college and university is you have a kind of revolving population.
Mm.
That every year 25% of your population is new. So you can't ever say, oh, I did that already, because the people that are here now, for example, the students who are at Berkeley now were not there in the free speech crisis in 2017, 2018. And so you have to not take it for granted because you've done something once. It's been an opportunity for everyone in the community to learn that.
That is such a good reminder for anybody working on a college campus. And one of the wonderful things about higher ed is the fact that everything is changing and always somewhat new, depending upon the generation coming in.
That's right. I had a mentor who once talked about the university as a series of concentric parades.
Mm.
And you have the student parade, and that goes around pretty
Right.
fast. Graduate student parade, a little bit slower. Staff parade, a little bit slower yet. And the faculty parade is the slowest. and, uh, And you always have to remember that people have different time experiences of the university.
For sure. So, which segues to the question I wanted to ask you about what you see now as you have exited the role as the most pressing challenges that are facing higher education today. We're obviously living in interesting times. So, how do you see it? Are there some particular areas that you think that we really need to be mindful of in the higher ed community?
Oh, there certainly are. I don't think I've ever lived at a time where there is more skepticism about, hostility to um, higher education, the value of higher education as now. And I think it's due to a combination of factors. One, and a really important one, is cost.
Mm.
That people think, you know, private colleges now cost $100,000 a year. Even a place like Berkeley, it's expensive. A lot of people feel it's just financially. Um, I can't imagine how I could pay for that for my kid. And there's also the competitiveness of university admissions,
Mm.
um, adds to that sense of lack of access. So universities have been historically in the US really important sources of social mobility. That is, at least in people's perceptions, less so now. So if you think about the political crisis in the United States right now, it it I think, and this is very much about the kinds of concerns about higher education. It has to do with who gets to be first in line. Um, People have to have a sense of fundamental fairness
Mm.
about access to universities, and that sense of fundamental fairness, whether it's controversy about legacy admissions or controversy about affirmative action, has to do with who gets privilege, who gets to be first in line. And so I think that universities really have to think about um, the issue of cost and the issue of access. Those seem to me the most important issues for higher education right now. I mean, there's certainly others. I mean, the financial models are broken for a lot of universities, so there has to be new thinking about financial models, which of course is connected to cost.
Mm.
But most important seems to me a sense that this is an accessible opportunity.
Well, it strikes me, based on what you're saying, that university leaders have an opportunity now more than ever to be an important voice for these issues, particularly given the swirling that we're seeing in the political world. Although it won't be easy at all. So, yeah.
Right.
So we've come to the end of our time. I have one final question, and I have to ask you about retirement. And as you step into this next, you've already stepped into this next chapter of your life. Any thoughts about what you hope your legacy will be, either at Berkeley or looking back over your career, and what you're going to miss the most about the work, and how you're spending your time? How do you envision this next chapter will unfold for you?
Well, what I miss the most are working with students, working with donors, working with faculty, it's the people, working with my team. I really do miss that. But I've been spending a lot of time reflecting. I'm going to do an oral history, and
Oh.
I'm thinking about writing a memoir, haven't quite decided. But how I spend my time, as you can see it all around me, I read a lot, I do music,
Mm.
I have much more time for friends and family, and I also am really involved in. I am on 6, which is probably too many not-for-profit boards, and trying to give the advantage of my wisdom, such as it is, to organizations that I care about.
Mm. What about your legacy? What do you hope that, any thoughts?
I actually don't have
No?
that many thoughts about that. I think what I've done at Berkeley is put student housing very firmly in the center of the agenda, so that's good.
Mm.
I think encouraged different thinking about financial models for the campus. It matters that I think I was, that I was the first woman chancellor.
Mhm.
It gave people a sense that this is a job women can do. So those are some of the things I think of as my legacy. I
Sure.
raised a lot.
You raised a lot of money. Yeah, so that's important. So, and I have to say, people, I'm located in Western Massachusetts. People still talk about you in Western Massachusetts in terms of your legacy at Smith. So I'm really glad to know you're going to be writing something and doing the oral history. Those will be very
I,
important. Yeah.
I say all the time that my I used my experience at Smith every day
Yeah.
in my role at Berkeley. It was such an important time for me, and I really treasured the college.
Yeah. Well, Carol, thank you so very much for your time today. As you know, I've been trying to get an interview with you for a long time. So I'm really glad that this has worked. And I know that our listeners will thoroughly enjoy and learn from your wisdom.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation.